Hi everybody, welcome back to Legit Learning, where we believe that legitimate learning lasts a lifetime. Now in this video, I'm going to talk about a subject that's kind of controversial, a subject that seems to be fairly misunderstood, and one that has given us a lot of great memes over the years. And that subject is Common Core. Now, a few of the areas I'd like to address are: what exactly is Common Core? And how important is Common Core if I choose to homeschool? It seems like a lot of the misunderstandings surrounding Common Core stem from how it tends to be discussed. Typically, when parents hear the phrase Common Core, it's regarding how their child is being taught. Their teacher is using a Common Core curriculum, but Common Core is not actually a curriculum. Common Core is actually a set of standards originally intended to be used nationwide. And if you hear the term Common Core curriculum, what that most likely is referring to is a curriculum that was, at least partially, designed to fit the Common Core standards. Now, to better understand what Common Core is, how it came to be, and why we ended up with so many great memes highlighting the confusing nature of what our kids were actually being taught, we need to know a little bit about some of the things that paved the way for these standards. To begin with, I want to take a brief tour of a few milestones that led us to where we are. While there are a lot of places we could start, I'm going to start with the 1965 Elementary and Secondary Education Act, or ESEA. And the reason I feel this is important is because it was the first substantial push by the federal government to control education at the state level by offering large sums of money to states in the name of reaching the underprivileged. Now, there's a lot of legislation that came before this, but the reason I'm starting here is because this act started different programs such as Title I funding, which sought to help schools in low-income areas. This funding becomes really important to schools, and as states learn to rely on this federal funding over the years, along comes the No Child Left Behind Act, or NCLB. Now, in the 1980s, the idea of progress standards in education really started to take root, and by January of 2002, we have No Child Left Behind. Now, please keep in mind, I'm not starting from the beginning of education in the U.S. I'm not covering every act or every renewal of these acts or every detail of these acts. I'm just providing a very rough sketch of how we got to Common Core. So the two things that No Child Left Behind did that I want to mention was, one, to force states into creating their own set of standards, which means states got to choose what was best for their populations. And secondly, they had to test their students against these standards. And if their students didn't measure up, then they could lose federal funding, such as Title I. Some states had higher achieving populations with higher standards. Some states had lower achieving populations with lower standards. This gets really controversial because everyone gets to set their own standards that they will be judged by. Overachievers could set their standards too high, and when their students don't quite measure up, they risk punishment. On the other hand, if a state is worried about losing that funding and they decide they want to play it safe, they can set their standards so low so their students do really well on the tests. Now, I personally feel that there's a possibility that could have been overlooked in this whole conversation, and maybe I'm wrong, but what if these states were creating standards to meet their students where they were, and then given time would have adjusted those standards to help raise the level of education in their states as appropriate? Who knows? Maybe time will tell on that one. After the uproar caused by No Child Left Behind, Common Core makes an appearance. Now, the Common Core standards were created mainly by politicians and representatives from the education testing companies until teachers' unions complained loudly enough that actual teachers were brought into the creation process, which I think helps highlight the complete disconnect between education legislation in America and what is happening to our children in the classrooms. Now, as badly as the federal government wants to take control of the public education system, on some level, they do seem to realize that states have certain rights, at least for now. So to implement these Common Core state standards, the Obama administration, during a recession, authorized over $4 billion for what was known as Race to the Top. What this did was offer enormous cash prizes of up to $700 million to states that were the most successful in implementing these Common Core standards. This gets kind of scary because as states are struggling for funding, they now have the mother of all carrots dangled in front of their noses, so they rush to spend every penny they had to develop the curriculum that would teach to the Common Core test, which for many states like Colorado was the PARCC test. Now on the surface, this wasn't that big a deal to the states that had won. But for the states that didn't win, well, let's keep in mind that their goal wasn't to find the best way to get their students to do well on this test. It was to find the fastest way to get their students to do well on this test. And a lot of states threw out their old curriculum to essentially blow their budgets building a one-size-fits-all, if it's not on the test, it doesn't matter curriculum. And then, because they didn't win the cash prize, they couldn't afford to get rid of Common Core. And much like an addict working through a moment of clarity, states had to sit in this haze of loss and bad decisions until they could once again afford to rebuild their curriculum. Now, there were 4 states that refused to adopt Common Core: Alaska, Nebraska, Texas, and Virginia. And there are a handful of states that managed to adopt and then quickly escape from the Common Core madness. And many more are in the process of exiting Common Core. Now, having said that Common Core is a set of standards and not a curriculum, I will add this in. There are some that would argue that due to the specific nature of these standards, at the younger ages, stating what the child should be able to do and when they should be able to do it, Common Core, some people argue that Common Core could be viewed as a curriculum. But strictly speaking, Common Core isn't a curriculum per se. So now on to the second question. How does Common Core affect me as a homeschooler? To answer this question, I'd like to start by saying you should always make sure to understand the homeschooling laws in your state. But here in Colorado, Common Core really has no effect on what you should or shouldn't be doing. As a homeschooling parent, you can choose to follow the Common Core state standards or not. It's up to you. Homeschooling can be a very personal choice for many, and finding the curriculum or method that works for you and your family kind of depends on figuring out what education means to you and finding something that aligns to your values. I will add a link to the homeschool law section of the Colorado Department of Education website in the description below. As far as tracking your students' growth, homeschoolers in Colorado have a couple of options. According to Colorado law, homeschool parents can choose to have their child tested with a nationally standardized test, such as the Iowa assessment, where you'll need to find a test administrator who can proctor the Iowa assessment. Or, as an alternative to testing, you can choose to find an evaluator to assess your child's academic progress. The assessment option is my preferred choice, and not just because I offer that service. I believe that a personal assessment of growth of a child is far more accurate than an impersonal, one-size-fits-all standardized test. I believe that measuring a student's educational development against where they were last year is more beneficial than measuring their progress against a faceless national average of students in a similar age group. All right, if you're interested in learning more about the hidden curriculum within education, or learning more about backward design and how these concepts can apply to homeschooling and how you can use these methods for good within your own homeschooling routines, please look for my video on the backward design of education. Also, in the description below, I'm adding a link to my email address, legitlearning2021@gmail.com. Please shoot me a message if you'd like to know more about homeschooling assessments or homeschool consultations. I'm here to help. If you'd like to find more information on the legalities behind homeschooling, I've added a link to the Colorado Department of Education website on homeschool law. And finally, I'm adding some links to some articles on No Child Left Behind and Common Core state standards. Looks like that's going to wrap up this video on Common Core. If you're interested in taking this journey with me, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to share your thoughts on this or any video I have, or have any issues you'd like to see me discuss, or have any questions you'd like to bring up, please feel free to drop me a message in the comments. Thanks for watching Legit Learning, where we believe that legitimate learning lasts a lifetime.